Again, good afternoon, good morning, everyone, as the case may be for you. My name is Rachel Jacobson. I serve as Acting Director at American Society of Adaptation Professionals, and we're thrilled that you've joined us for this webinar on the National Coastal Resilience Fund. And of course, since this is American Society of Adaptation Professionals, we're excited to support you in using the National Coastal Resilience Fund to meet your climate adaptation goals. I want to invite everyone to share an introduction to yourself in the chat if you'd like. We'd love to know your name, if you're coming to us from an organization, maybe where you're located. And I personally am located in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is lands of the Anishinaabe and Wyandot peoples. All right, you are here today for our webinar series on the National Coastal Resilience Fund. So just to situate us on where we are in this series, which we are hosting in partnership with Throw Environmental as members of the National Coastal Resilience Fund Field Liaison Team. So today is going to be an overview session. We're going to be mostly sharing presentations with you all, and we'll also have a Q&A at the end. We'll have an overview of the National Coastal Resilience Fund. We'll share some details about the 2023 National Coastal Resilience Fund RFP, talk about what elements are necessary for potential applicants to cover in their pre-proposals, and we'll share some insights about beginning to put together a successful application. This session is being recorded, and it will be sent around for all registrants to view. And then we'll have two subsequent sessions really focused on getting down and into the nitty-gritty on technical assistance for pre-proposal applications. So we will have our first technical assistance session on March 1st on March 15th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And there you'll have an opportunity to actually go into some small groups and really get specific technical assistance on such as writing a good pre-proposal, budget and finding match, setting up partnerships, and doing stakeholder engagement. And then in our second technical assistance session, which will take place on April 5th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, you'll have an opportunity again to go into small groups, to ask your last minute budget questions, talk about transitioning from the pre-proposal to the full proposal, as well as learn more about submissions through the Easy Grants software. If you are registered for today's session, you're registered for all three parts, and feel free to join as many as you are able. All right, so just briefly, we would love for you to mute yourself. Please mute yourself so that we can make sure to hear our presenters. Again, cameras may be on or off as you like. This session is being recorded and will be sent out to all registrants, and you're free to share it widely as well. And we will have a discussion and Q&A following our presentations. If you have clarifying questions, please post those in the chat and we'll get to them during the Q&A. And if you have specific questions for our presenters, please post those in the chat, or when we get to the Q&A function, or excuse me, the Q&A portion, you can also use the raise hand function to ask your question out loud once we get there. Brianna Nails, ASAP's program manager, is here today to help us with any technical issues. So feel free to chat Brianna Nails directly if you need any technical support. Okay, so before we jump into our content today on the National Coastal Resilience Fund, I want to share a little bit about American Society of Adaptation Professionals in case this is your first time joining us for an event. So ASAP is a professional association and social impact network for adaptation and resilience professionals. And our network includes close to 1,000 individuals and 45 organizations. We have members coming from all sectors, the public sector, for-profit companies, nonprofit organizations, and academia. Folks are concentrated in the US, but we serve all of North America, and we have members from all over the world. And together with our members and partners, we at ASAP are advancing the field of climate adaptation by learning from Western science, Indigenous knowledge, and the lived experience of those addressing climate impacts in their communities. We are privileged to have 45 organizational members, an incredible group of leading adaptation organizations from federal agencies, cities, engineering and planning firms, community organizations, and more. And these folks provide invaluable support to the ASAP network, advanced adaptation field, and receive support from ASAP to advance their adaptation and resilience goals. Here at ASAP, we have programs that are designed to build the capacity of our members to do effective adaptation work and work together to strengthen the adaptation field. And they're divided into 4 areas. We have ASAP Connects, where folks come together to meet one another, share what's working, advance critical issues in the adaptation space. We have Adaptation Careers, which supports folks both in making sure they have the education and training opportunities they need to do effective and equitable adaptation work, as well as find opportunities for work in the adaptation space. Adaptation Voices, where we share what's working and inspire adaptation action. And then ASAP Serves, where folks become leaders in the adaptation field and really give back to the field. And our webinar today sits between our ASAP Connects and our Adaptation Careers program areas. It is an extension of our work advancing funding and finance for adaptation and resilience projects and our work supporting innovations in coastal nature-based solutions. So we advance innovations in funding and finance for adaptation work through our Ready to Fund Resilience program, which is a collaboration between ASAP and Climate Resilience Consulting, created with support from the Climate Resilience Fund. And through that program, we've developed a self-guided toolkit on funding and finance for adaptation, a virtual training program. We have a peer learning group that meets monthly on funding and finance for adaptation work. And we also provide targeted technical assistance to organizations and local governments to support advancing their adaptation goals through funding and finance from both the public and private sectors. And then as part of our work on the Field Liaison Team for the National Coastal Resilience Fund, we, in addition to hosting this webinar series, also host a peer learning space for folks to discuss innovations in nature-based solutions. So we have monthly sessions that highlight promising practices for equitable, effective, nature-based coastal resilience work. And this group draws on case studies of past successful NCRF projects. It also serves as a space for potential grantees to interact with ASAP's network of experts, partners, and advisors as they form their proposals. And so before I turn it over to our NCRF presenters today, as I mentioned, this webinar series is part of ASAP's work on the Field Liaison Team for the National Coastal Resilience Fund. We're so thrilled to be part of this team, which is led by Throw Environmental and also includes the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society. Throw Environmental assists communities and organizations across the United States in identifying, implementing, and sustainably financing action to address the impacts of climate change. Through outreach, technical assistance, and institutional development, Throw helps its clients address environmental challenges through resilient, sustainable, and practical methods. So if you are here from Throw Environmental and you want to give a little wave or a shout out in the chat, we would love that. And the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society is a nonprofit intertribal organization founded in 1983 by a group of tribal fish and wildlife professionals to assist Native American and Alaska Native tribes with the conservation, protection, and enhancement of their fish and wildlife resources. NAFWS is the only national tribal organization with a specific focus on tribal fish and wildlife resources. NAFWS hosts conferences, trainings, webinars, youth education, and provides technical assistance to 574 federally recognized tribes in the U.S. and fish and wildlife professionals working in Indian country. So if you are here from the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society, would love for you also to give a wave or say hi in the chat. And I also want to mention that Native American Fish and Wildlife Society will be hosting, it is in the process of hosting, a multi-part webinar series on applying to National Coastal Resilience Fund, specifically focused on tribes. So if you are a tribal member, if you're part of a tribal project, or you work for a tribe, please check that out. There's a link to that webinar series that'll be coming around in the chat. And with that, I am so pleased to turn things over to Kyle Gray from Throw Environmental to begin with our overview of the National Coastal Resilience Fund.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel. Good to see everyone. Yeah, as Rachel kind of teed us all up, this whole presentation will be about the National Coastal Resilience Fund. This is more introductory to give you an overview and a sense of what this program is and how it functions, and also to introduce our team and the other folks that we're working with at ASAP and the Fish and Wildlife Society, how we all work as field liaisons and how you can get that outreach and how you can get technical assistance. So with that, we'll start with an overview here. If we can go to the next slide, but first we'll start with what is Throw Environmental and who are we and why are we doing this work? So Throw Environmental, as Rachel mentioned, is a consulting firm based out of Rhode Island that does a lot of work on climate resilience funding and financing. And as such, we've been contracted by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to serve as field liaisons for this program, the National Coastal Resilience Fund. So in that capacity, we lead the field liaison team. And our outreach takes a number of different forms. Most of the time, we're just promoting climate resilience in this program as a whole. So that's either through engagement at workshops like this or through other webinars or events, conferences. But a lot of the time, we're also providing really direct one-on-one feedback and follow-up with folks who are thinking about submitting a proposal or who have submitted a proposal but were not selected for funding. We can also provide some feedback there. And then, of course, if you have been selected for funding, we can also check back in with you to make sure things are moving along smoothly. And if there are any troubleshooting needs, we can help you think through those as well. So if we can go to the next slide here, that will get us started with the program overview for the entire National Coastal Resilience Fund program, which I will keep referring to as NCRF. So this program is administered by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and it's been around for about 5 years now. So I believe we're entering into the 6th round of funding. Typically, this program was around $30 to $40 million per year, but with all of the infrastructure investments over the last few years, it has really skyrocketed up to $140 million. That's annually for the next few cycles. That's how much is expected. And that is for the nation's coasts. So it's a national program, which includes the East Coast, the West Coast, the islands, Alaska, and the Great Lakes. So a pretty big pot of funding for the nation's coasts. And it is all driven by the importance of using nature-based solutions to enhance coastal resilience and fish and wildlife habitat. And you'll see in that last bullet point, and is in capital letters. And that is because these programs and projects that we'll talk about have to enhance resilience and fish and wildlife habitat. It's not one or the other. You can't just have a resilience project with no focus on fish and wildlife or vice versa. It really does have to have those dual benefits, and it has to do so through nature-based solutions. And you'll also see this list of partners on the right-hand side of the slide. And what's exciting about this funding program is that NCRF, it operates through the Fish and Wildlife Foundation, which is an extension of the federal government, but it's not federal itself. So it can pull in dollars from federal agencies like NOAA and the Department of Defense, and then link those up with other private sector contributions. And you'll see some of those contributors on the right. So that public-private partnership helps to get more dollars out the door, and it helps to make things more efficient in actually issuing these grants. So if we can go to the next slide here, we will overview some of the program priorities for this whole NCRF program. And I already mentioned the first 3, but I want to reiterate these. This program at its core focuses on nature-based solutions that enhance community resilience and fish and wildlife habitat. So those are what you can refer to as the most required elements of an application for this program, right? Without having those elements, it's going to be really difficult to be competitive. So those will be the most important pieces of this entire program. When we talk about nature-based solutions, those can look differently across the country. It can be living shorelines, it can be coral reefs, it can be beach and dune restoration, wetland restoration, floodplain restoration, a lot of different options, and it will depend on your coastal geography. So that we would want to talk about with you individually to make sure that you're approaching it in a way that makes sense, it is practical for your geography. When we talk about community resilience, there are 2 pieces there. The community piece really focuses on the resilience impact to community-based infrastructure. So what are the critical assets and the critical infrastructure in your community that would benefit from an NCRF project? And the resilience piece really focuses on the coastal hazards that are making your community vulnerable right now, and that we need to work in the context of to become more resilient. So those coastal hazards would include things like flooding, erosion, sea and lake level change, sea level rise, permafrost melt, land subsidence. It will all change based on, again, which geography you're in the country, but those hazards should be coastal and they should be driven by coastal processes. And that will be one of the most important parts of this program. And then lastly, of course, this is the Fish and Wildlife Foundation. So there must be a tangible and meaningful fish and wildlife benefit, right? And benefit to the habitats and ecosystems that fish and wildlife species rely on. So those are the most core elements of this program. Then the preferred elements, or kind of the elements that will, add on top of those three that will make you more competitive, are listed on the right. And these are what you really should work to build into a proposal. And not every proposal will have these to the fullest extent, but this is what you should be striving for. So in every proposal, we're looking for community impact and engagement. So making sure that you're engaging partners in a meaningful way, and that engagement leads to tangible outputs that have kind of the fingerprint of those partners on them still. It's not just for the sake of engagement, there's actually a meaningful connection there. There's some room in this program for innovative techniques. So of course you could submit something that's tried and true, but there is room for innovative techniques, pilot projects, demonstration projects. They have to happen at a certain scale, and they have to, be able to transfer lessons learned across a geography and across a community or a region. But there is some space for innovative techniques that help us think differently about how to enhance resilience in fish and wildlife habitat. And then lastly, you'll see here, we want to talk about sustainability. The efforts that are moved forward in this program, right, if you were to be funded, they really should work to enhance resilience in a sustainable way. So we're not looking for one-off projects. We're not really looking for projects that will enhance resilience in the short term, but won't really have a meaningful long-term impact. We're looking for projects that will be catalytic and that will push your community forward to becoming more resilient overall. So next slide, please. We will talk about the geography of this program. I mentioned this a couple times. And it is national, it's coastal, so a lot of the areas that you would expect are highlighted in orange here. But the easiest way to navigate whether or not you are eligible for this program based on geography is to go to this map, which we can put the link in the chat. This is the NCRF footprint, and it is an interactive mapper. And at the top left, you'll see that with this mapper, you can type in your city, a landmark, your zip code, whatever you need to, and it will zoom you right in and show you if you are in the orange boundary. If you're safely inside the orange boundary, you're set to go geographically, you're considered eligible for the program. If you're on the edge, I would say reach out. It could be a GIS issue. So please feel free to ask us about that. And if you're, pretty far into the country or your respective state and you're well outside the boundary, you're probably not eligible for this fund based on geography. But technically speaking, it's defined as Huck-8 watersheds that drain to the ocean or the Great Lakes, and then adjacent watersheds that are influenced by tides or are low-lying. Next slide, please. So we talked about geographic eligibility. Now we can talk about organizational eligibility to help you decide, if you are in that geography, whether or not your organization or community can apply to this fund. And thankfully, there's a pretty big pot of who is eligible here, and it's a lot of your standard players. So states, tribes, territorial governments and agencies, municipal governments, regional governments, all of those folks are eligible. Nonprofit organizations, educational institutions like universities, as well as commercial organizations are all eligible. So if you are working with a consultant, they could be the lead applicant. And then semi-federal organizations or partnerships are also eligible. And the best example there is a sea grant. So, all the coastal states will have a sea grant that they're assigned to, and those sea grants could be the applicant. There's just some nuances there that you have to be mindful of. So it would be best to reach out ahead of time to make sure that you're aware of those. And in terms of who is not eligible, it's everyone on the right-hand column, anyone from federal agencies, no foreign organizations or public entities. And then you can't be an unincorporated individual to apply for this fund. Next slide. So that's kind of the overall logistics for this program. The next few slides are going to go into the specifics on the different categories for funding. And you'll see there's 4 categories on screen, and I'll break each of these down individually. One of them is planning level, and that's the first. And then the last 3 are all project level. So, I really encourage folks to be mindful here, though, because for this program, you should only pick one of these categories to apply for funding. If you have a project that's starting at the beginning of its life cycle and you need to get from planning all the way to implementation, You would really want to approach that in a way where you're submitting, separate applications over the course of a number of years, or maybe you're, going through NCRF for one piece of that funding and then getting funding elsewhere for the rest of the project. But we really would discourage any projects that come in that are, applying for start to finish proposals, that are applying for design build. Those projects just won't be competitive, right? We really need to pick one project category here and make sure you're working towards an individual specific outcome. So after picking one of these, or I guess in the process of picking one of these, you'd want to narrow it down based on what your intended outcome is. So if at the end of your project, you want a plan and you want a resilience plan that tells you where to go next, you'd be applying for that first category. If you're at the point of, being ready for construction, then you apply for that last one, restoration implementation, and now you can actually construct. And if you're somewhere in the middle with design, there are those two categories as well. But you're really working towards one specific outcome that is aligned with these categories. Again, all projects should be advancing resilience and fish and wildlife benefit, and they should be doing so in a way that focuses on nature-based solutions as the primary motive of that project. So we're going to break these down one by one. We can go to the next slide here. And the first one is community capacity building and planning. So this is, a really interesting category for this funding program because it's probably the most flexible, right? And this is where, as a community, if you haven't really engaged on resilience projects in the past, this would be the best place for you to start, because this is where you can start to conduct that planning, go through community planning efforts that will result in a resilience-focused plan with some implementable projects included in that plan. And it's all community-driven here. So the average project length for a community capacity building and planning project is around 2 years. And typically, these will result in a comprehensive resilience-focused plan. That will usually be through a process that includes a lot of stakeholder engagement, a lot of capacity building. You're working with partners. If you're a municipal government conducting this plan, you'd want to make sure you're working with the nonprofits in the area. You'd want to work with potentially other municipalities that are neighboring you, maybe the state, as well as some of your residents and other community-based organizations, to make sure that you're getting a holistic example of community resilience. And then that is all leading to a resilience plan that will really tee up some specific nature-based projects down the road. So you would not want to be applying for this plan if you were looking to do kind of a really broad brush community vision or some type of visioning plan. This isn't a comprehensive plan process. It's not like a standard, full community comp plan. This would be much more focused on the individual projects that could be funded down the road, the individual nature-based projects that would then, potentially be implemented within the next few years. So very project focused. If we go to the next slide, that will show you the first project level category, and that is site assessment and preliminary design. So this is where, we encourage folks who have already gone through that planning to now think about the specifics of one of the projects that came out of their resilience plan. So this is where you would be able to take one of those projects and think about where it should be sited, what the feasibility of the project is, and what the early designs would look like. So in this category, projects tend to be around 1 year. And the outcome that you're working towards is getting that design to anywhere between 30 and 60% completion. So you don't need to finish it, and you really shouldn't finish it in this category, but you want to get as far as being able to make a go or no go decision. And essentially, you're just deciding, are we going to move on with this project? If so, where is it going to be sited? And are the early plans in place that need to be there to help us move to the next phase? So prior to this phase, you'd want to make sure that the projects that you're assessing and that you're doing design for have been planned elsewhere, right? And that can be through a prior NCRF grant through that first category, or it could be through other community planning that you've already done, right? A lot of the states will require this planning. Some communities do it on a habitual basis anyway. So you could look back to those plans and pull out a nature-based project, and maybe this is where you start to design that project that you've identified elsewhere. But it does need to be grounded in some previous plan. Again, this is where you're focusing on, can we just go back 1 second? This is where we are focusing on site assessment. And there's also some room here for preliminary permitting conversations. So you can start that and moving that along. And there's also some room for baseline monitoring here. So you would be able to gather that data and then be able to compare that data to the end of the project once it's actually implemented. But I do just want to caution folks, we in this program, the projects that are just focused on data gathering as kind of their main output are not competitive. It should be, a smaller part of a much larger project. All right, now we can go to the next slide here. And this one is focused on final design and permitting. And projects here tend to be around a year and a half, a little bit longer than the last one. But this is where you're getting to that final design, 90 to 100% completion, really as far along in the design as you can be without putting the shovel in the ground. And this is where permitting conversations are well underway. They're happening. You've got a good sense of how those permits will play out. They don't necessarily all need to be completed by the end of this category. They don't need to all be in hand, but you should really be well into that permitting process throughout the course of this grant. And then at the end of this grant, if you were to get awarded in this category, you would be positioned for restoration ready implementation, right? So that would be happening in the next category if you were to be funded again, or even if you were not funded again, you would then be teed up to implement this project with funding from another source. And that will happen through, the design and the permitting, and there also may be that baseline monitoring again that you can compare back once you do implement. All right, so next slide, we will talk about the restoration implementation. And this is the big one. This is the one that everyone's always excited about. Projects here can be up to 3 years in length, and they should also include an additional year of monitoring. So I mentioned that baseline monitoring before. You can collect that early data in the earlier phases, and then here you would collect the post-implementation data that you'd compare back to. The outcome here is implementation. It's construction of your project. It's that monitoring that comes after it. And this category is where the prior three kind of all build up sequentially towards this big one. So projects here should have been prioritized elsewhere, either through planning or through a previous NCRF grant. All of your assessments and design should be completed, and then you should be ready to secure all of your permits and any other necessary approvals in order to start construction. Next slide. So those were our general, kind of categories for this program and how they each work. A couple other points, though, that I did want to touch on here. So for this program, match is not required, but it is encouraged, and it's strongly encouraged. And that's because having match demonstrates broad support for the project. So whether that match is coming from partners or from the community itself, it's obviously showing a certain level of buy-in from the folks who are engaging in the project. But NCRF and the foundation also understand that it can be hard to secure match for some organizations and communities. So it's not required, but again, it is strongly encouraged where possible. And that can be cash or in kind. Of course, if you're going through this program, it's important to make sure you're complying with all necessary federal, state, and local permitting. So you would have to make sure you understand what that process is like, and that you're staying in compliance and talking to those permitters. I also wanted to touch on some of the projects that are not priorities here. So rebuilds after severe storms, coastal rebuilds, as well as research projects, a lot of which will be coming out of a university or research-focused nonprofits, or projects that are looking to move forward non-natural structures. Those three categories of projects are not competitive and not priorities in this program. So I would encourage you to not apply for NCRF if that's the main focus of your project. Hybrid projects, though, are acceptable, and those would be projects that use nature-based solutions with some other sort of built gray infrastructure in a way that still, embraces the impact that nature-based solutions can have when we're talking about community resilience and fish and wildlife habitat. Again, there need to be really clear benefits here to community resilience in the context of flooding, erosion, sea and lake level change, as well as clear benefits to fish, wildlife, and habitat. And for the latter, that fish and wildlife piece, you can demonstrate that by citing, statewide or even federal fish and wildlife plans or other documents that, will show whether those species are endangered, threatened, whether they're critical species, all of that. You can show that this is having meaningful impacts on those populations. We already talked about nature-based solutions, so I won't belabor that point, but I do want to reiterate that priority is given to projects that, again, are demonstrating transferability and that they're taking innovations and lessons learned and moving those across a community and a geography in a meaningful way. So if you go through a community planning process, right, and say 3 municipalities come together and they say, we're going to do a resilience plan across those 3. If there are a lot of lessons learned that come out of that. If a lot of nature-based solutions are kind of falling into one bucket, if there were really productive ways of engaging the community, you would want to pass those lessons learned off to other communities and other, organizations in the region. So making sure that we're spreading the wealth and that information is being transferred and scaled is important. And this is especially important for efforts that are, led by or engaging tribes and underserved communities, making sure that, as we're engaging with those communities, they're in the driver's seat for those projects, and then the lessons learned are being shared. And then a last point here I want to mention is, this is more logistics, but this program has a pre-proposal and a full proposal. So the pre-proposal for this cycle, and the RFP did just come out a week or two ago. The pre-proposal for 2023 is April 12th. And those proposals are, relatively short in length. It's about a 2 to 3 page project narrative, as well as some other requirements. And that really just, it's required, but it gives you the opportunity to put that idea out there for the folks reviewing it, to determine early on, without doing too much of the work, whether or not your project is competitive. After that, pre-proposals will come in, and then they'll be reviewed and evaluated by the reviewers over the course of the spring. And then you would be invited by invite only to submit a full proposal. So those full proposals are due June 28th. So invitations would probably go out sometime in mid to late May. And then over the course of late May into June, you'd have that time to put together the full proposal. And that narrative tends to be anywhere between 10 to 20 pages of project narrative, as well as, those other supporting documents. So we can go to the next slide here. So all of that was, important program information, an important overview to make sure you have kind of the basics, the who, what, when, where, why, and how about this program. But the next section that I want to focus on really relates back to the different tips and tricks and lessons learned that there are out there to help you put together a competitive pre-proposal. Because it's great to show you all the information, but without giving you the tools or at least some of the guidance to do that, it can still be challenging. So over the next few slides, we're going to focus on, some kind of insider tips that you can use to build a competitive proposal. So we can go to the next slide here. And I tend to break this down by, thinking about the grant writing process. What can you do before, during, and after you actually submit that grant? So starting with before, it's important to make sure you're developing your project idea. And I know a lot of folks on this call are probably wearing, 3, 4, 5, 6 different hats in the positions that they're in. So you've probably got dozens of projects floating around. For this program, it's important to really think through, what's the best fit, which one is nature-based, which one aligns with resilience and fish and wildlife benefit, and how can you think through that idea in a really holistic way that you can put together a proposal. So once you've started to develop that idea and flesh it out a little bit, it's important to do so, with your partners and with the community that you're working in. And through that process, you can establish a plan for success. So that's where it's important to really make sure you can lay out what the goals of your project are, big kind of whole project-wide goals. And then what are the smaller objectives that you would use to chip away at those goals? What's the timeline that you're working within? Is it compatible with this program? And then what are the responsibilities? Who's doing what? How are your partners engaging? Are they just providing support, or are they, doing some of the work alongside the applicant themselves? After you get all that information, that's where you can start to ask yourself, is this the right program for you? Right? Considering everything I just went over in terms of eligibility, the match requirements, the expected number of awards to go out, how much average awards are, the types of projects, the priorities, all of that. Based on what you're seeing for this program and based on your project itself, do those two align? And can you make a competitive case for funding with your project? If you're asking yourself these questions and you're not sure of all the answers, that's okay. That's where I would say it's time to start building a relationship with either the program officers at NCRF on this program, or this whole field liaison team that we've got here today putting on this workshop for you. We're here to help think through and brainstorm project ideas. So if you don't have answers to some of the questions on screen, that's the exact right time to be reaching out to make sure that we're thinking these through before a pre-proposal. So we can go to the next slide here. And this one talks about what you should be working on during the actual writing and assembling of your proposal. So I tend to find with these proposals, especially in the pre-proposal stage, that writing sets the tone, right? You've got to be effective, organized, and clear in terms of how you're putting this proposal together, because it really is on the applicant to demonstrate the need that that community has and how the funding will address that need. And, in the end of the day, I think you're selling your project to the reviewer. They're the ones who are scoring it and deciding, is this aligned with this program? So I think it's in the applicant's best interest to make it as easy as possible for the reviewer to find the information they're looking for. So I would encourage you to go back and forth with the grant solicitation, the request for proposals that came out. Look at that and think of it like a rubric and ask yourself while you're writing, how can you take the language from the RFP and work that into your proposal? Or, how does your proposal match up with the RFP? If you were the one scoring it, how would you score it? Do you feel like it scores highly? Are you using that same language and are you applying to this specific grant rather than just putting together a general proposal? Because it does have to be grant specific. So pay attention to those different requirements, the priorities, some of the keywords that they use over and over. I've been saying nature-based solutions, coastal resilience, and fish and wildlife habitat a lot. So those are some of them. Make sure you're building partnerships and talk about those partnerships in your proposal because that's what the reviewers are looking for. So next slide here is what to do after you've put together your proposal. So first, take a break, take a breather, go for a walk. Obviously, this all gets very time consuming and it can be difficult. So take a step away because that usually makes for a better output. After that, though, reread, revise, and start to ask folks for feedback. So that can be the other partners that you're working with here and assembling this proposal. It can be colleagues, or it can, at certain points, it can even be the field liaison team. We can look at what you've put together and give you some feedback. But you really want to make sure that altogether the proposal and even the abstract and the title are accurate reflections of your project, and they're quickly communicating what this project will do for the community. Again, this is where you should compare it back to the program priorities and the criteria. Think of the RFP like a rubric and start to score yourself and see how that works. If you don't get funded, I would encourage you to recycle and adapt your proposals either for this fund again next year or for different funding programs, and think through, what would need to change, where are there some weaknesses, and where can you take the feedback that you're getting from folks and adapt the proposal so that you can use it again for a different fund or for this fund again once it's built a little bit stronger. So I think we can go to the next slide here. And Rachel, I just want to check in here to make sure we're doing good on time before I move on to these next few.
I think that we wanted to get to available assistance around now, and go to audience Q&A in a couple of minutes.
Okay, so let me breeze through this one quick, and then we can go right to the available assistance.
Sounds good.
So this last slide here, I guess these next two, but I'll make sure we get through them quick, is about how this funding can really tee up longer term, more catalytic investments. And a lot of times that can be through financing. So the funding from this grant and from any grants, it really is limited, right? There's a time limit on it. There's a limit on how much funding can be awarded. So just in that sense, the initiatives that you can take with grant funding are also limited. So what NCRF really likes to see is a project that can take that grant funding and be catalytic with it, and can use that grant funding to really start to engage other projects and to start to scale those up and build a system of projects that can make a community more resilient. So think about that in the context of how you're working in this proposal, and even in your proposals while you're writing them, think about how you can take that funding and kind of move it to the next step and use it to kind of start up other resilience projects and include that in a proposal to show what the long-term impact might be. We can go to the next slide here. And I'm going to say for the time being, we can skip over this one too. I kind of just reiterated those points. So let's go to this last one here. So talking about the assistance that is available for folks. I mentioned earlier, we do these events to kind of just spread the word, but there also is that one-on-one assistance available. So if any of this piqued your interest, and if you've got a project that you're thinking about, it's important that you're reaching out to the field liaison team so we can work with you to work through that project idea, think about what is the most competitive element and what are some elements that need some work. And we can help you build that idea and think about it in the context of this program in a pre-proposal. We can't write it for you, but we can really help point you in the right direction. So I would encourage folks to reach out so they can get that guidance. And Rachel just mentioned some of the assistance that's available. So you can, do that outreach, but there's also some work that you can do on your own too, to just help to outline your ideas. And there's a link I'm going to put in the chat right now. It's called the NCRF Project Brainstorming Worksheet. And this is something that the Field Liaison Team had put together for folks to use. And it's pretty basic. It's not rocket science, but it is a great tool to help organize your thoughts going into the pre-proposal stage. And again, it's asking some really basic questions just to help outline your idea. Things like, what category of funding are you applying for? What's the coastal problem? What's the intended solution? What are the resilience and the fish and wildlife benefits? And how do you expect nature-based solutions to help enhance those benefits? And then there are some other questions about transferability, community engagement, things like that. So again, this is, it's not a pre-proposal. There was still other work that would need to be done to assemble a pre-proposal. But these are some of the main questions that we would be asking you as field liaisons. So you can do some of this work on your own, or you can bring this into a meeting with our team, to discuss with the field liaisons to help flesh out that idea a little bit more and to help put some actual body to it. Because a lot of these are probably living in your head, and it's time to, put them onto paper. And then from here, we would think those through with you and help you decide whether or not it's time to put together a pre-proposal. So with that, I think I will kind of leave it there and pass it back to Rachel and Brianna.
Great. Thank you so much, Kyle. And we'll leave it here up on this slide as we move into our Q&A. And I just want to ask if Ariel Mayan is on the line, who's going to join us for our Q&A as well. Ariel, do you want to give a quick wave?
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Ariel. Thank you so much, Ariel Mayan. Would you like to introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. Hi, I'm Ariel Mayan. I'm the program manager for coastal resilience at the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. So I oversee the NCRF program and work with Throw and everybody on this call leading this webinar as our field liaison.
Thank you so much, Ariel. And as we transition into our Q&A, Ariel will join us to help answer questions. We have a couple of questions that came in while you were speaking, Kyle, so let's go through them. The first question is Puerto Rico included? And perhaps if you want to speak broadly to U.S. territories, that will be great.
I can take this one. Yes, Puerto Rico is included. You would want to make sure for any geography, so I'm just saying this broadly for the entire country, that you're using that that footprint, the map that I think Brianna had put the link to in the chat, to make sure that the specific location that you're in is within the coastal boundary. But broadly speaking, yes, Puerto Rico, the territories, Hawaii, Alaska, the Great Lakes. It's not just the East and the West Coast.
Thanks so much, Kyle. And next question here, and as we move to this next question, I just want to remind folks that you can put questions in the chat or you can raise your hand, so feel free to do either of those. Next question, have you ever funded or considered a wetland mitigation bank project through this program?
We have not funded a wetlands mitigation bank project. We don't fund mitigation, so that would not be an eligible project.
All right. Next question, and this may not be specifically relevant to NCRF, but we'll share it in case anyone has insight. If you know of similar programs that are funding adaptation and nature-based solutions for global South cities, especially African cities, do you know of any similar programs?
I'll say that NCRF is only the US and its territories, so we don't fund any international projects. And most of NIFWIF in general funds the US and its territories. We have a few foreign exceptions for some of our programs, but those are more species related programs that we have.
Great. Next question is whether stormwater detention basins are eligible if they can show fish and wildlife benefits.
Rachel, I just want to make sure I heard you. You said stormwater detention, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's kind of a nuance there with any stormwater or green infrastructure projects. If those are primarily water quality focused, then they would not be especially competitive in this funding program. If the green infrastructure that you were using was really driven by, taking in water quantity and reducing flooding, then there's a potential that it would be competitive. But projects that are really focused on, nutrient reduction and water quality, those just aren't motivated by coastal resilience in the same way, so they wouldn't be as competitive. And I think green infrastructure could kind of stump folks in that sense. So I would just be careful around that.
Thanks, Kyle. And we talked about this a little bit, but if you could expand on the selection criteria, particularly with respect to, that category of innovative projects as opposed to tried and true.
Yeah, so I think and Ariel, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think the foundation is open to projects that are innovative, that are, helping us think about coastal resilience in a different way. So, it would have to be any project, and it's not just the innovative ones, any would still have to be, based on sound science and, have to be technically feasible. The cost that it's operating at has to be balanced with the benefits. So all of that would have to be considered. But I think overall throughout the program, there's definitely, openings for folks that are coming in with more innovative projects that haven't been tried elsewhere, assuming that they are, sound in nature and that they're, reasonable in terms of costs and feasibility.
I'll also add to that, it doesn't necessarily have to be a completely new technique. We've seen projects take a technique that's used in the Gulf and transfer it to the Mid-Atlantic. That's never been done before. So it's not necessarily completely new ideas when we're talking about innovations.
Next question here. In the case of coastal areas exposed to wildfire, along with coastal hazards, can wildfire components be included in the NCRF proposal?
Yes. Again, it shouldn't be the focus of the proposal, but in places like Hawaii, we have funded some fire preventative measures because they will aid in erosion in that area. So I think it depends on the context and the geography of where you're applying.
Okay, our next question is another one about a specific strategy. So natural stable channel design for channel conveyance of floodwaters. Oh, Kyle, I think you're on mute.
Yep. Yeah. Sorry, I was kind of mumbling to myself reading it. So I'm no engineer, but reading that back, it seems like that could be eligible. I would just have to know more about the project specifically. But I think if you're conveying floodwaters and trying to get those out of areas where they could be damaging infrastructure and harming, fish and wildlife habitat, then that would be something that tends to be in line with this program. I would just need to know more than just that in general. But Ariel, correct me if I'm wrong there.
No, I think that's accurate.
Okay, so we have a few more minutes for questions here. If there are any others, folks can feel free to raise their hand as well as type in the chat. Let's give it just another few seconds here to see if any more questions come in. Okay, so here is a question about cost effectiveness requirements. Are there any cost effectiveness requirements?
So I wouldn't say there are requirements, but it is one of the criteria that we evaluate proposals based on. So we are, considering that your project is cost effective, but there is no hard and set rules around that.
And a couple points, I know these weren't in the chat, but a couple things I wanted to mention that are new to the 2023 cycle, or at least the language in the RFP. And these are questions that we've gotten in the past. So I think Ariel and her team have made those language changes to address some of these questions. But folks have asked us in the past if non-federally recognized tribes are eligible, and the answer is yes, and that's reflected in the RFP. There have been questions about projects that have been previously funded and whether they're eligible again. The answer there is yes, they're considered pipeline projects, and those are actually a priority for funding. And then folks have also asked about, the balance between, how large projects are funded across the country versus small projects. And I would just encourage you there to think about scalability, using that as a way, how to scale and transfer your lessons learned and how to scale projects to other locations. That can be one way for a small project to overcome some of the challenges that typically happen with a project that's small in nature and as they're competing with larger ones. So just some initial thoughts that folks may at some point have.
All right. Oh, here we go. Oh, we've got some folks just chatting in the chat, which is always wonderful and welcome as well. Any other questions that are coming up for folks? While we're waiting for that, Ariel, is there anything based on the questions that were shared or the things that Kyle shared that you would want to expand on before we move into our next step section?
Nothing particular jumps out. I would just recommend reading the RFP and all the materials that we have on our website. We have a ton there for everyone. So yeah, just making sure they're reading that. And we do update some of the materials on our website. So continually checking back and making sure that you have the most up-to-date information. Because we do update our FAQ depending on how many questions we get from our webinars and everything.
Excellent. And we'll be sure to send those links around both today and in our follow-up email from today's webinar. Kyle, anything else that you would want to close us out with before we move into next steps?
I would just reiterate with what Ariel said, make sure you're reading the RFP thoroughly and kind of checking back that constantly. And then if there are questions or if you're just not sure about a project idea, please do reach out because we can certainly answer those for you.
Okay, wonderful. All right, so next steps. I hope that this was a thorough overview for you all of the National Coastal Resilience Fund and that you'll leave today with knowledge of where to find the RFP and also a lot, even more insight and details than what's shared online in the RFP, as well as knowledge of where you can reach out for help as well. I want to encourage you to join our 2 upcoming sessions to get technical assistance for preparing an excellent application pre-proposal for the National Coastal Resilience Fund. So we'll have session 2 in this series taking place on March 15th from 3 to 4 Eastern Time. And during that session, we'll have some targeted breakout rooms for you to join where you can get your specific questions answered on various topics. And we'll be using that same format in the final session of this series, which will take place on April 5th from 12 to 1 Eastern Time. And if you're in the room today, that means you are registered for the upcoming sessions. And so hopefully you can join one or both of them. And if you have any colleagues who did not register prior to today's webinar, they can still register, and if and when they do, they'll receive today's recording as well as information about how to join subsequent sessions. As I mentioned before, we also have a peer learning session, our peer learning group focused on nature-based solutions in support of the NCRF program and our work on the Field Liaison Team. And the upcoming meeting for that group will be on March 16th. At 3 p.m. Eastern Time, and that group does meet every third Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And the focus will be for this month on the NCRF, building partnerships and helping move interested participants towards potential applications. So Brianna is going to send around in the chat the link to register for that peer learning session. I want to encourage folks to fill out the NCRF brainstorming worksheet that Throw has put together. It's a great idea to fill out that worksheet before you join us for these upcoming sessions so that you have a chance to sort of work through your ideas around NCRF and you can come really fully prepared to engage. It's not a requirement, it's just a recommendation so that you're ready to really ask targeted questions and have targeted discussion as much as possible. And then, of course, our other set of next steps is around actually applying for the National Coastal Resilience Fund. And so I want to highlight some key dates for that. So there is another pre-proposal webinar, I believe this one is hosted by NCRF. Is that correct, Ariel? Great. So NCRF will be hosting a pre-proposal webinar at 3 p.m. tomorrow. The due date for pre-proposals is April 12th, and then full proposal invitations will go out from between mid to end of May, and then invitations for full proposals, or excuse me, full proposal due date will be at the end of June, June 28th. And with that, I want to thank you all for joining us today and just remind you or let you know if this is the first time joining us that we would love for you to become a member of ASAP. And you can see the link to join us right here on the web or on the slide. And Brianna will be sending it around in the chat as well. And we'd love to see you at an upcoming peer learning meeting. We have peer learning on close to a dozen topics monthly, and you can see that list on the left-hand side of the slide. And so Brianna will send around the calendar link, which lists all of our peer learning opportunities in the chat, so you can check that out. You can join us here at ASAP, and we hope to see you for our upcoming session on March 15th as well. So thank you all so much for joining, and we hope to see you soon.